These are some recent paintings I've made. They're on imperial, not surface paper. Imperial is about 15 by 11, so they frame to up to about 2016. This is my first demonstration. My colours are arranged on the right hand side of the paper, and as you can see, it's a country church. This is the photographic reference I used. The church is in Wiltshire. First of all, I'm putting a wash of raw sienna over the whole painting, and I'll strengthen it here and there, especially around the spire of the church. These message boxes will appear from time to time, and I'll probably repeat them because I think some of the messages are worth emphasising. I'm brushing some cerulean blue into the sky, which is merging with the raw sienna, taking the edge off the blue, and I'm putting the same blue into the shadow side of the church. Now I'm using the side of the brush. It's an ordinary man-made fibre brush. It's one of my own, a Martin Goode brush. And I'm dragging the brush on its side, almost flat against the surface of the paper to create the foliage, keeping it quite dry. And I'll cut the roof line in very carefully. I went over there, so I took it off with my finger. I'm now picking up some darker colour to suggest the shadows in the tree. I'm being very careful where I pop those shadows in to keep the shape of the tree. Very loose, wet washes. The colours I used were Payne's Grey and raw sienna for that tree, and just a darker mix for the shadows. Now the tree is behind, so I'm indicating that behind this porch. I'm using the back of the brush, which is sharpened, to drag in some branch marks and twig marks into the tree. You've got to do this when the paint is damp. It mustn't be wet or dry, otherwise it won't work properly. Now the bush in the front is a brighter colour, and I've used lemon yellow and Payne's Grey again for the mix. You can see between these two yellows and Payne's Grey you can get a huge variety of colour, and if you start adding burnt sienna and cerulean blue and light red to these mixes, and also ultramarine, you can mix any green you want. And it's better not to have a green on your palette. It's better to keep mixing your colours, because the painting vibrates, and there's no way that you can imitate nature's wonderful range of greens. So you just do your best by mixing and mixing and mixing. You can safely mix 3 colours together and not get a muddy result, but if you mix 4, you're heading for trouble. And if you put a colour up on its own onto the paper, it won't vibrate. It needs to have other colours to work with, to merge with. And now I'm using a reticulation method. I'm dropping some clean water into the drying mix, and it will cause it to flower and blossom. And sometimes this happens in your skies, and it's an effect that you don't want in the sky, but in a bush it's very, very effective. Now I've gone back to my hog bristle brush. I've got quite a number of these now, all different types, and I cut them into different shapes and to get different effects, and it makes things easy for you when you do this. And I'm stippling the surface, mixing the colours as I go along and allowing to mix freely with the colour that was put there before, and it's a magical way of painting trees. Now you have to change to an ordinary round brush for the branches, the trunk. Popping in some other colours, allowing it to mix freely. Now the church itself, to get this stone wall effect, you can use a mixture of raw sienna, burnt sienna and Payne's grey. If it was a Cotswold church and you want the honey colour, instead of using Payne's grey, you can use those two colours together with cerulean blue. And you can also use alizarin crimson, raw sienna and cerulean blue for the honey coloured stones of the Cotswolds. On the shadow side, I'm putting in my basic shadow colour, which is light red and ultramarine, and before that dries I'll drop in some of the local colour so that it harmonises with the other side of the church. Here we go, dropping in some of the local colour, allowing it to mix freely. My board is at a very awkward angle, incidentally. It's almost upright. But this is the best angle when you're filming for the viewer to see the painting. But if you're painting at home or in the studio, the best angle is between 15 and 20 degrees from the horizontal. Then the washes will flow slowly down and you can control them better. As it is, when I put a wash on, it runs very quickly down to the bottom and forms a puddle. But I've learnt to control that. And I take up the excess quickly with a dry brush. Now this bright reddy brown colour is a mixture of burnt sienna and light red, and it's very good for a slate roof, a bright red slate roof, Norfolk or Buckinghamshire, and lots of places all over the country. I usually introduce a little olive green colour into the lower margin of that roof to suggest moss. This is the shadow side of the roof, and I'm using the standard mix again of ultramarine and light red, but dropping lots of the local colour into it. And as you can see, it's mixing on the surface of the paper and vibrating quite a lot. And it finishes up with a nice granular effect, which is very, very good, and you don't have to do much more to the roof. If you can make your statement in one colour, do so. If you need to add a second wash, that's okay, but don't add 3. And if you need to put a third wash in, don't add 4. So the principle is to use as few washes as possible in modern watercolour. Just suggesting the shadow under the portico. The light's coming from the left, as you can see, and it's catching the tops of the bushes. And rather than paint the stones, I usually put a texture mark into a church. The vicar probably won't like that because the churches are usually kept clean in country churches, but it's very effective and gives the church an oldie-worldy look. I'm now putting in a bright mix of raw sienna and cerulean blue for the foreground grasses, dabbing at them to make some texture marks. And now a big sweep for the road, using all the dirty colours I've got on the palette. I'm drying the washes between takes with a hairdryer, and I'm not showing you that. Casting the long shadows, leaving the brightest area on the left, shining through the portico. And strengthening up some of the shadows here and there. It's just a quick impression to show you how to paint shadows and to paint the dark side of the church. I'm not trying to make a great work of art out of it. This shows you that the colours are, you can move them with a brush by wiping them off because they don't stain the surface of the paper. In this demonstration I'm painting a tree using a grey colour which I've mixed with ultramarine and burnt sienna, and I'm painting the whole tree in grey first using the hog bristle brush, and before it's dry I'll introduce some of the colours of the tree, and they'll blend with the greys and make quite an interesting shape and texture. Now I'm bringing in some greens now. Very, very laid back olive green, and before the first wash is dry it's running into it, drying unevenly, leaving some hard edges here and there. Right, it's quite effective for a tree in the middle distance. And in my next demonstration we'll use this technique to create one of these trees. This is a church in Essex. It's a very old wooden church, and as I showed you before I'm using the same technique to do the tree on the left. I've now put some of the greens in. I'm painting the trunk green. You very seldom see a brown tree, and lots of the trees in Epping Forest, and this church is very near to Epping Forest. Lots of the trees are that sort of mossy green colour with touches of other colour in it. Oh, this is the shadow side. The light's coming from the left. I'm increasing the colour. Now I'm using the back of the brush to drag in the bushes and trees in the background. While it's damp I'm indicating some trunks and branches and trees in the background, just suggesting them more than painting them. There's another one in the background behind the spire. This is very useful to paint the spire in a negative fashion, softening the top edge, taking it back into the distance, because just in front of it there'll be a tall yew tree, very dark, and will make a lovely foil on the right hand side of the painting. Now I'm using the hog bristle brush, which incidentally holds a great deal of paint, and I'm holding it very much on its side and dabbing and dragging the brush to create the look of a yew tree in its dark olive green colour. I've used a mixture of raw sienna and Payne's grey for this type of foliage green, with somewhat more Payne's grey. I'm now using a mix of ultramarine and light red to paint the spire of the church. This will be done in several applications, and I'll dry them in between the takes with a hairdryer. This is the shadow side of the church. In fact, I'm moving along painting all the shadows. The roof will be red, and I'll paint over the shadows which I've created, and that'll give me a nice counter change. We're back to the church again now, painting the lighter side of the grey roof and strengthening up the shadows on the left side. Controlling the wash to a certain extent by drying the brush between my fingers. I'm now introducing the red colour of the roof, which is a mixture of light red and burnt sienna. I'm adding a little bit of raw sienna into this, and I'll also add some ultramarine to change the colour slightly, to create more interest. That's the same red being applied over the shadow which was created before. It works quite well, this method. I'm using raw sienna and ultramarine and a touch of cerulean blue for the various greens of the grass, keeping them very light so they reflect the bright sky above. I'm now painting the figures in a very simple manner, just shadow figures, but they add interest to a painting. These are dark and they'll stand out by contrast against the lighter background behind. Now for the darkest darks of the church. Shadow just under the eaves, And the slats, it's a wooden building, and these are just slats, not windows. Now, just as at this point I'm putting the shape of the vicar standing in the doorway to welcome the Sunday morning worshippers. That's a very good ploy to bring counter change into a painting. I can't see very clearly on my photographic reference, and if I can't see, I just paint it in a loose, impressionistic manner. Just a little bit more detail here and there on the tree. Let's cast some long shadows. The shadows really help a painting because they describe the way the ground runs and give the painting more depth. In fact, you can cover up a multitude of sins with shadows. That very dark shadow against the sky stands out very well. If you use this ultramarine light red mix, it allows the detail to show through from underneath, because it's a transparent mix. Right, rubbing out the pencil marks is my usual practice. If it spoils the painting here and there, I can always re-establish these pencil marks. And now another church. This is the photographic reference that I used. I'm going to simplify it. I'm not going to put so many gravestones in, but there'll be a few here and there. I'm mixing some raw sienna and this is some light red, and into the light red I'm putting some ultramarine. Now a mix of ultramarine and cerulean blue, the two blues, to get a cobalt type of tint. I'm now going to use those washes to paint the sky, and I'm painting some raw sienna into a pre-wetted paper. I want the steeple to stand out against the glow of the colour behind, so I've concentrated the warm colours in the middle of the paper. And I'm now building the shape of the clouds with the mix of ultramarine and cerulean blue. Now with a paper kitchen towel, I'm dabbing off the shape of the clouds roughly. I'll modify these in a moment. I'm running some more pigment into the upper area, and it'll run down and stop on the dried marks, and this will form the general shape of the clouds. And then with a brush which has been dried between my fingers, I can move the paint into the final shapes. The light's coming from the left hand side of the painting, so I'm putting the cloud shapes on the right hand side, away from the source of light. Now I'm just modifying the shapes into their final resting place. I'm popping a little bit more pigment which is running down and mixing with the pigment from before. With a dry brush I'm picking off some of that pigment, and we've created quite a lively sky. Now I'm using the side of the brush to build the shape of the tree on the left, dragging it along the rough surface of the paper. Keeping in mind that the shadow side will be on the right hand side of the tree. Now I've changed to a smaller brush and I'm cutting some of the shapes of the gravestones into the lower part of the tree, painting in a negative manner. And I'm popping the branches in the lighter part of the tree, and where they stand out against the light colour. And now I've moved to a tree behind the one in front, and this will help build the shape of the church. This negative method of painting buildings is very, very effective. Don't be frightened to use your fingers. You can put your whole hand into a painting to create textures. There's a very dark tree on the right to act as a foil. As a matter of contrast, it's always a good idea to make this tree either bigger or smaller than the church spire, or the church tower in this case, so it doesn't look like two equal masses. Now you can see how the sky is quite lively and just enough behind the rest of the painting now. It's dried much lighter than my original washes. And you've got to bear this in mind when you're painting, that watercolour always dries lighter. I'm using a brush for scratching some twigs and branches into the tree. The back of a brush which I've sharpened into a point. And as I said before, you've got to do this when the paint is just damp. And then what you're actually doing is just moving the paint away from the brush. This is a bright wash of lemon yellow to contrast vividly with the dark tree. It's counter change again. In watercolours you'll put darks against lights, colds against warms. It's that makes the painting look very lively and interesting. I'm putting in a wash of raw sienna and cerulean blue. I made a couple of passes at it to get the angle right. It's very difficult for me to paint horizontal lines because I'm sitting to the right of the painting and it's almost upright, so my hand doesn't naturally fall in that position. But as you can see, it's working quite well. As I'm painting along, I'm profiling the top of the grass in front, ready for the next wash. And as I go nearer, I progressively make the colour brighter and richer. I'm not putting much detail into it, it's just a loose way of working. And as you can see, these demonstrations are only taking a quarter of an hour or 20 minutes to do. You're watching most of it, it's very little being cut. You can see the colours I'm using: lemon yellow, light red and Payne's grey, to get the colour of the church. This is the lit side of the church, the bright side. I always keep the kitchen towel nearby. Sometimes it's scrunched up underneath my brush in my right hand, ready to use. It's an invaluable tool. These are not sable brushes, they're man-made fibre brushes with a touch of sable in them. And they just hold the right amount of liquid for this sort of work. Sable brush tends to pick up all the paint from your palette and hold masses of colour. And it doesn't allow me to work freely because I like to mix the colours all the time. I don't mind going back to the palette frequently. Each time I go back I bring up a slightly different colour, and it adds interest and makes the painting vibrate. And before it's dry I'm dropping in other touches of different colour here and there to suggest stone in the distance. I'm not painting right up to the edge, I'm leaving slithers of unpainted paper showing. That makes the painting sparkle a bit. On the dark side of the church I'm using ultramarine and light red as my shadow colour, and before that dries I'll add the local colour into it. Now here we go, this is the colour from the other side, and as you can see it brightens the shadow up immediately. I'm not being too fussy, I'm not being too meticulous. The speed helps sometimes when you're doing this sort of watercolour. You can't possibly paint a church with all its detail. You can't possibly paint nature as it really is. Skies are huge, wonderful things, and you're trying to paint them with a few brush strokes. It's not possible. So the best thing is to use the power of suggestion. I choose my colours carefully. They're a lot of earth colours and mineral colours, and when they mix together they give you a granular effect which is very, very pleasing. All in the middle distance suggests rocks and stones and brickwork and tiled roof, and also foliage on trees. It's suggested by the way the paint dries. You'll find that most landscape artists have got these colours. Ultramarine, cerulean blue are two very strong granular colours, and when mixed with the earths, which are yellow ochre, which I don't use, raw sienna, light red, which is actually burnt yellow ochre, and a brown, which is, you can use burnt umber, and which I do use sometimes, you get the wonderful separation of colour as they dry. And this is not so obvious when you're looking at a painting which is upright. It won't dry like that. But if you have your board at 15 degrees, as I suggested earlier, they'll dry in a wonderful granular manner, and you can control it easily. In fact, as it's drying, you can tap the board slightly and cause the heavier particles to go to the lower part of the paper. I hope I haven't got too technical for you. I'm now beginning to reinforce the picture by putting the windows and the shadows and here and there, popping around all over the place, strengthening some lines just as the mood takes me. There's another look at the original. I'm now making the finishing touches to the painting. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope the subjects I've chosen have been of value to you.